struggle for existence in the world or anything like that until sin came into the world, when man brought it into the world, and then God had to pronounce the judgment of the curse on the creation which was given to man as his dominion because of his introduction of spiritual disorder. God pronounced the judgment of physical disorder on his dominion, and so there's been suffering and death in the world since then. But that's where it came from. Stephen Jay Gould, the leading modern, or at least most articulate modern evolutionist, in one of his articles says, in one way or another, says this phrase, evolution is a fact of science. He says it no less than 12 times. Evolution is a fact of science. That's a litany that they repeat, expecting everybody to believe it because they say it so often. But then when people ask him, what is the evidence of science that proves evolution? You know what he says is the evidence? He says the best evidence for evolution is imperfections, like the panda's thumb, which he says he could have designed better if he had done it, or a good engineer at least could. He said because there are imperfections in the animal world, that proves that God didn't have anything to do with it, because God would make everything perfect. Well, yeah, but you see, the fact that God made everything perfect doesn't mean it's going to stay perfect. And we do have the reality of sin in the world, and mutations and disease and decay and disintegration and death because of sin. There are imperfections in the world, but rather than proving evolution, what that proves is that we are alienated from God because of sin. But that's the best scientific evidence that even a man like Dr. Gould can come up with. Now, of course, this idea of struggle for existence and survival of the fittest has had terrible impact on the world as a whole. For example, in the laissez-faire capitalism, which became the watchword of England and America and the Western world, Germany and so on, back in the 19th century. Even many of our conservative political people today still kind of stick with evolution because they think that the survival of the fittest applies in society and in economics and so on today. But we need to realize that all of this was based on evolution too. For example, the great Andrew Carnegie, whom we honor because of his charitable endowments and so forth, the great steel baron, some would call him a robber baron back in the 19th century, he said, the law of competition is here. We cannot evade it. No substitutes for it have been found. And while the law may sometimes be hard for the individual, it's best for the race because it ensures the survival of the fittest in every department. So let's exploit labor. Let's do whatever we have to do. What's good for the corporation is good for the world and so forth. And here's what he said also in his autobiography. He says, I remember that the light came in as a flood and all was clear. Not only had I got rid of theology and the supernatural, but I had found the truth of evolution. And so that was the basis for his actions. And John D. Rockefeller said much the same thing, and so did Raymond Hill, the railroad baron, and all the great robber barons of the 19th century were basically following Herbert Spencer, particularly with his survival of the fittest concept. They didn't believe in child labor laws or anything like that because the fittest will survive, and that's what's going to contribute to the advancement of society. And of course, in Germany, it led finally to World War I and to the great racist implications of later on of Hitlerism and to World War II. And I don't have time to document that, but let me just read one statement from an authority, Daniel Gossmann, in his book, The Scientific Origins of National Socialism, talking about Adolf Hitler. He says, Hitler stressed and singled out the idea of biological evolution as the most forceful weapon against traditional religion, and he repeatedly condemned Christianity for its opposition to the teachings of evolution. For Hitler, evolution was the hallmark of modern science and culture. Hitler was a strong evolutionist. He was also an occultist and committed to astrology and so on. But he basically was a Darwinian and an evolutionist, and he felt that in the struggle for existence among nations, that the greater nation would survive, and so he believed in the superiority of the Aryan race and the Teutonic nation and so forth. And so it was justified in his mind to wage that kind of war. And even in England, Alexander Keith, who was an Englishman and opposed, of course, to Hitler, nevertheless he acknowledged that Hitler was a good evolutionist and that he was following the principles of evolution in his plan for the war. Mussolini, the same thing. Well, we could go on and we could talk about communism, which is based on evolution, racism, completely based on evolution, not on fundamentalist Bible teachings in the South at all. All the great evolutionary scientists of the 19th century were evolutionary racists, including Charles Darwin. You can see that in his book, The Descent of Man, in which he makes it clear that there's an ascending order of evolution among the races, and the Caucasian race is going to eliminate the lower races and so forth. That's what he says. And Thomas Huxley said the same thing. All of these men of science, evolutionary scientists in the 19th century evolutionists, and the same thing applied particularly among the anthropologists even up to the mid-20th century. Men like Henry Fairfield Osborn, the director of the American Museum of Natural History, believed that the Negro race, for example, was not even the same species as Homo sapiens. They said terrible things. And of course, with the World War II and Hitler's genocide and his racist activities, racism lost favor among scientists, and evolutionary scientists today, of course, are not racist. But they were up until the mid-20th century. And they based it on evolutionism. Preservation of favored races in the struggle for life was the subtitle of Darwin's book. And then we can come down to the practices we're concerned about today, the drug culture and abortionism and pornography and immorality and so forth. If we had the time, we could document that all of these are based on evolutionary philosophy. Now, it doesn't mean that, for example, every young woman who has an abortion or a doctor who does one is an evolutionist. People commit sin for all kinds of reasons, but whenever anybody tries to rationalize these things on a scientific basis, they fall back on evolutionism as their rationale. Now, let me just give one quote. This is from a man by the name of Eli A. Schneur, who says he is the director of the Biosystems Research Institute in La Jolla, California here, and is chairman of the Southern California Skeptics, which is an affiliate of the American Association for Advancement of Science. Now, this was in the LA Times. I'm not sure how accurate it is. Well, yeah, of course, everything you read in the paper is bound to be true, but anyway. Anyway, here's what he says according to the quote in the paper. He says, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. Remember that? That is, well, he explains it. He says, this is a fundamental tenet of modern biology that derives from evolutionary theory and is thus anathema to creationism as well as to those opposed to freedom of choice. Ontogeny is the name for the process of development of a fertilized egg into a fully formed and mature living organism. Phylogeny, on the other hand, is the history of the evolution of a species, in this case, the human being. During the development, the fertilized egg progresses over 38 weeks through what is, in fact, a rapid passage through evolutionary history. From a single primordial cell, the conceptus progresses through being something of a protozoan, then a fish, a reptile, a bird, a primate, ultimately a human being. There's a difference of opinion among scientists about the time during pregnancy when a human being can be said to emerge. But there is general agreement that this doesn't happen until after the end of the first trimester. Now, you see what this leads to. The only rationale for abortionism, for killing the fetus in the womb, that was in the womb being developed into a child, is that it isn't really human. If people who propose freedom of choice and abortion and so on really believed that this was a human being, then they would have to acknowledge that killing it is murder. But they don't believe it's a human being, and the rationale for that is it's going through its evolutionary history. It may be at the fish stage, and therefore it's no great thing to catch a fish, or if you kill a monkey or something. So therefore they rationalize it by saying it's developing through its evolutionary history, but the fact is that this recapitulation theory, the so-called biogenetic law, has been disproved at least 50 years ago, and no knowledgeable scientist, I'm surprised somebody like this man who claims to be a biosystems research man, would still believe in the recapitulation theory because it's completely unscientific. The embryo never does go through a fish stage. It never has gills and gill slits and anything like that. It never has a tail, all that. It's, in fact, the DNA, which programs the whole development, indicates it's a human being right from the very time of conception. There's no rationale whatever in terms of real science for the idea that it never is a human being. But the idea that it isn't is based on evolution. Once again, that's why I say that all these harmful practices basically find their rationale in evolutionism. I think we could show that's true of our modern drug culture. You see, Aldous Huxley and others like him, Timothy Leary and others who were the founding fathers of the modern emphasis on drugs back some 50 years or so ago, they said that we've done away with God. Evolution has proved that there's no God, but yet we still need that religious experience. And so Aldous Huxley said we can compress an eternity of joy into just a few hours with the materials that the pharmacologists provide for us. And so the drug culture is based on basically the rejection of God because of evolution. And free sex and so on, barnyard culture, well, What about the New Age movement? You've heard of that, I'm sure. And once again, there's no